start with our discussion on Indian writing in English with a basic introduction to the evolution of this particular genre, Indian writing in English. To start with, we basically have to look at the evolution of the term Indian writing in English. Earlier, we had the term Anglo-Indian writing. Now, Anglo-Indian is basically a term that refers to literature by English people who have lived in India or they felt something about India and they have written about that in their works. So they are basically Englishmen. For example, an American writing about India is an instance of Anglo-Indian literature. You have E.M. Foster in Passage to India talking about India. So that is an instance of Anglo-Indian literature wherein it is written about India using India as a locale or as a subject matter by Westerners. So it's basically writing about India by Westerners. Now, people didn't like the use of this particular term because it referred to writers abroad. Then we had the term Indo-Anglican literature. And Indo-Anglican literature, it invokes a colonial connect very directly, and also it is said to have had a lot of overtones with regards to colonization. And therefore, even this term is not considered suitable to refer to Indian writing in English. And then we had the term Indo-English literature, which refers to English literature that basically originates in India. And if you look at this particular term, Indo-English literature, the emphasis is primarily on the Englishness of literature and not on the Indianness, or it is not on the problems that are faced by Indians. India is not at the center when you're talking about Indo-English literature. Then we had the term Indian English literature, wherein the emphasis was primarily on the Indianness of literature written in English by Indians. And this basically raised questions about nationalism, national identity, pride in religion, and there was also a feeling of national history that was inculcated by way of Indian English literature. And then we had two great stalwarts. You had K.R. Srinivas Iyengar and also C.D. Narasimhaya, who basically spoke about Indian writing in English. Now, if you look at this particular book, which is a very good book and something that you can actually use with regard to Indian writing in English, you will realize that it is a book written by Srinivas Iyengar. Now, he is one of the major proponents of this particular genre called Indian writing in English. And another person is C.D. Narasimhaya. They both were instrumental in making Indian writing in English a branch of literature that is prescribed for study across colleges and universities in the world. And when you say Indian writing in English, it basically refers to the felicity and facility with which Indians could use English in their works. Now, we'll move on to looking at Indian writing in English. There's this particular quote by Ahmed up on your slide now. Every book written by an Indian inside the country or abroad is part of a thing called Indian literature. For instance, you have Salman Rushdie. He is an author with whom a lot of controversies are connected. For instance, you have Salman Rushdie, the very fact that he doesn't have a passport, it shows that he does not probably belong to India, but then his work, Midnight's Children, is referred to as an important work, a monumental work with regard to Indian writing in English. The same is the case with Ruth Pawar Jabwala. You have, she is basically a German woman who got married to an Indian and she spent most of her youth in India. So therefore, we consider her writings as part of Indian writing in English because she lived most of the time of her life in India. Now moving on, Indian writing in English is basically a pejorative term because you also include translations as part of Indian writing in English. Now the best example for translation is Geetanjali. The basic thing about translation is that you have this very famous text by Tagore, Geetanjali. The text was originally written in Bengali, but then it was not accepted. It was not given a warm welcome into the world of literature. So what had to be done was it was translated, and the English version is what received the Nobel Prize. So that is the role being played by translation. And as far as Indian writing is concerned, English is generally the primary language, and you write it or you translate it to the mother tongue, or you write it in your mother tongue and then translate it to English. So therefore, you could actually look at the coexistence of English and the mother tongue, and there is a symbiotic relationship between English and the mother tongue, wherein the English that is used by people is basically being shaped by the mother tongue. For instance, you have Mulk Rajanan, and Mulk Rajanan in his works he uses Indian words. For instance, you have Pan, even R.K. Narayan for that matter. So all that is basically an instance of the influence of mother tongue on English. And also, many Indian writers are bilingual, and in fact, some are even trilingual, and that is because of the variance in culture and language that is evident in India. Therefore, you have Priyamvada Gopal, who is another important name that figures in the understanding of Indian writing in English. She, in her book on Indian writing in English, or tracing the history of Indian writing in English, she calls bilinguals as bilingual self-fashioning. The passage, the whole of the excerpt is titled Bilingual Self-Fashioning, wherein she talks about how people who are bilingual had the ability to define what is meant to be modern, to have a history, and consequently what is to be Indian. So you have bilingualism also coming in way of Indian writing in English. For instance, you have Girish Karnad. His mother tongue was Marathi, but then he wrote his plays in Kannada, which is actually a language that he had learnt. So we have a number of instances in Indian writing as far as the knowledge of literature in Indian writing goes. Coming to the beginnings of Indian writing in English, or how English in India began originally, we go back to the British Raj, wherein you had the colonizers setting up colonies. They brought with them trade and commerce, and they also brought with them a beautiful language, that is English. As we all know, the first college that was set up was the Hindu College, or the Presidency College, which is, Presidency College is the name that is given to it right now. And it is also called the Oxford of the West. The sobriquet that is given to Hindu College is Oxford of the West. When this college was actually being set up, you also had Brahmo Samaj coming up, and Rajaram Mohan Rao was the main proponent of Brahmo Samaj. We'll come to that in the next slide. Now, how do you consider something that is from India as literature is the next question. So there is this French literary historian, Taine. Now, according to Taine, literature is the creation of three factors. This is also an important concept in literary criticism, wherein Taine says literature is basically a creation of three factors. There are three factors that combine together to form something that is called as literature. The first is race. Now, as far as India is concerned, there is a coexistence of people from mixed races. For instance, you have Aryans, you have Dravidians, you also have Mongolians living in the nation. So therefore, as far as race is concerned, India actually has a mixed Indian race, we could say. Then talking about the milieu. And India itself is more than being a country, it is actually called a subcontinent. Meaning to say that you have people from all religion, people from all faiths, people from all races, people from all cultures. That is why it is called as a subcontinent. And then talking about the moment. And Iyengar, he basically says that the moment was the meeting of the West and India. If you look at this particular idea of meeting, he does not mention about colonization as something that was traumatic or as something that was imposed. But rather, he talks about colonization as just a simple meeting wherein we welcomed the coming of English. He basically talks about how English was welcomed by people in India, but then it is not mentioned as something that was imposed upon people living in India. This very famous social reformer, Rajaram Mohan Rao, and Iyengar, when talking about Rajaram Mohan Rao, he says Rajaram Mohan Roy not only wanted English and more English in India, he also wanted more Englishmen in India. The Britishers actually they were concerned about education in India and also wanted to start a number of universities and colleges where education would have probably been in Sanskrit or Persian. But Raja Ram Mohan Roy, it is said by Iyengar that he probably had the potential to foresee the scale to which English will grow up to becoming a repository of knowledge. And that is why he actually insisted on English education in India. And also, then we had the Macaulay's Minutes in the year 1835. He made a number of comments that would hurt the sentiments of a number of Indians. You have him saying one shelf of English literature books will actually be equal to the whole of the literature that is written in the regional languages, in Sanskrit and also in Persian. And he said that because of the existence of a number of myths. In India and in Sanskrit, we actually have a lot of myths. For instance, you have kings with 10 heads, gods with 20 hands, and with 50 limbs. Now, that myth is why he actually thought that there was nothing useful for the people. But however, he forgot to realize that there are also a lot of myths associated with Latin and Greek. And you have Iyengar also using the term Brahmanized Britons because there were also a few Britons who were both Occidental and Oriental in their thought, wherein they could also appreciate the sensibilities of the Indians, they could also appreciate the culture of the Indians. And then we had missionaries coming up with the onset of missionaries. You had the coming of a religion called Christianity and also the education that was being offered by the missionaries is noteworthy. And then he also talks about how dictionaries, grammar, and translations also helped in the development of English in India. And with the coming of the printing press, a number of books were being read by people. And also, we had Indians setting up newspapers. You have the Bengal Gazette, which is the first newspaper in the nation. He basically talks about how the reading public grew by leaps and bounds, and that in fact impacted the learning or the understanding of English throughout the nation. This is in brief as to how English grew in India. For an understanding of Indian writing in English, you could probably go back to reading these two books, Arvind Krishna Mehrotra's Illustrated History of Indian Literature in English, which is published in the year 2003. Now, this is fairly a very recent historical detection of the growth of Indian writing in English. The next book is by Srinivas Iyengar. It is Indian Writing in English, which was published in the year 1965. So, this basically traces the history until 1965.
Thanks a lot for watching. Do remember to like, share and subscribe.